everyone, welcome to another episode of Vic's Garage. Got another historical video for you today. I'm going to get into the history of Chrysler's A279 motor program, otherwise known as the ball stud Hemi. This was a pretty cool concept motor that was extremely close to getting put into production vehicles. They had working concepts and built motors. It was supposed to be slotted for 71 to 73, sometime in between there, and it just fell victim to the times. So it's got a pretty cool backstory, some pretty famous people involved with it, and I think it'd be a cool little history lesson for you guys. So without wasting any further time, let's get to it.
During the late 1960s, Chrysler was on top of the muscle car era with the 426 Hemi. The Elephant, as it was known, was king of the streets and the racetracks.
With this four-letter exciter hung on each side, you won't find too many takers at the traffic lights. This is one of the quickest ways I know of to do your thing. 426 cubic inches topped by hemispherical combustion chambers delivering 425 horsepower. That's about 1 horse per cube. And if that doesn't excite you, you better check your pulse.
But for all that was great with it, it had its faults. For one, it was expensive. Between 66 and 72, only roughly 9,000 were built, making it more of a novelty. It was extremely heavy, outweighing a 440 by 100 pounds. The main reason for the 426 Hemi's existence was to be sanctioned for racing. It wasn't a big moneymaker outside of the old saying, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Couple that with having multiple big blocks with different architecture, the B, the RB, and the 426, there was some good money that could be saved by streamlining production to one big block. This is why Chrysler decided to start working on the A279 motor, otherwise known as the ball stud Hemi. The goal of this project was to consolidate all the big blocks into one platform. This would reduce costs. 2 displacements were originally decided on, a 400 cubic inch and a 444 cubic inch version. Contrary to what some say, Chrysler engineers didn't steal the cylinder head design off Chevy or Ford. While similar to them, the engineers took cues from the Australian 245 cubic inch inline 6 Hemi, which was primarily in the Australian Valiant. During the initial design phases, there were issues with the head bolts and coolant passages. These issues forced some changes to the head design. Engineers looked at the Australian inline 6, and in this motor, each rocker was mounted on top of an individual pedestal. You can see the pedestals here and how the rockers were mounted. And here you can see Chrysler's other motors, like the 426 Hemi on the left and the 383 on the right. The rockers are mounted on a rocker arm shaft. By converting to this pedestal style, it simplified the head design and stud layout issues. Now you can see a picture here of the actual combustion chambers for both the ball Hemi and the inline 6 and see how similar they are. Other notable design features were equally distributed intake ports, unlike the B and RB motors, which allowed for more consistent fuel mixture, 2¼ inch intake valves and 1.94 exhaust valves, same as the 426, versus the 2.08 and 1.74 inch valves in the 440. They also used a smaller 14mm spark plug versus the standard 18mm spark plug. This was done so the plug could be moved closer to the center of the combustion chamber. A 10.5:1 compression ratio was targeted, but the surviving engine, which we'll get to later, was apparently measured around 9.8:1. A dual plane manifold and a Carter ThermoQuad was chosen to top it off.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with Carter ThermoQuads, I actually have one here. I used to run this one on my car. I switched it out just because I got kind of tired of trying to figure out how to tune it properly. It ran well most of the time, but I just wasn't very proficient when you try to get that little extra out of it. Most of these things are around 800 CFM, plus or minus. They're pretty unique though in the carburetor world. Chrysler ran these from 71 to approximately 84, 85. Obviously because of the increasing emission regulations coming from the federal government. So some things with these carburetors that helped with it is you'll notice that you got the really small primaries and you had the oversized 2¼ inch secondaries, I believe. So that would be useful for when you're like just putting around town and stuff like that. It would greatly reduce your emissions or just general cruising. And then you still had, you know, all the flow and stuff you'd love when you got on it. Another thing that made these unique is this black part that goes around the carb is like a plastic. It's called a phenolinic resin. So that was purpose was to keep the temperatures of the fuel down. So they say or at least claimed that it would keep your fuel about 20 degrees cooler. The issue with that, though, was they were prone to warping and cracking issues. So over time, you would have leakage and other issues with these carburetors. But they were used on everything from Chrysler, basically from like, you can find them on the RVs to all their production vehicles over those years until they got away from them.
The end result was a motor that was 6.5 inches narrower than the 426, weighed 100 pounds less, and supposedly had the great performance numbers. We don't have the actual dyno numbers or anything, but reports said that the 4.4 version outperformed the 440 and made less power than the dual carb 426. If you remember the goals of the program and the problems with the Hemi, it looked like this motor was going to be a winner because it solved all of them. An estimated 12 or so castings were made, and 3 complete motors were built for testing. In the end, 50 or so were estimated to have been built. But by late 1969, increasing government emission regulations, fights with the Insurance Institute, and Chrysler's own financial issues were starting to take its toll. The motor which Chrysler hoped to get in the cars between 71 and 73 got scrapped. By 1978, Chrysler was struggling to stay afloat, and anything that could be sold was sold, even if it was for scrap and pennies on the dollar. This, unfortunately, is where most of these engines ended up. In June 2007, Mopar Action ran a story on how the one engine happened to survive. While stuff was getting ready to get sold for scrap, Dick Maxwell, a member of the Ram Chargers drag racing team and Chrysler technical advisor, asked to have one of the ball-stud Hemis put aside for himself. The plan was to drop it into a T-bucket hot rod. That never happened. Now somehow, Dandy Dick Landy ends up with one he claims he got from Bob Cahill, who worked at Chrysler R&D. So now we have this weird triangle where we don't know if the one that Landy ended up with is the same one Maxwell put aside, and Cahill somehow ended up with it, or maybe that he was mistaken and got it from Maxwell, or maybe there's a second motor out there somewhere. Well, in Landy's possession, he apparently swapped the cam, fixed a few wear issues with the motor, and got it to make more horsepower than the legendary 426. Years later, Chrysler decided they wanted the engine back, and Landy refused. Long story short, after some legal battles, in 1999, Landy ended up loaning it to the Chrysler Museum, but not before attaching some aluminum plates to the valve covers, saying that it was his property on loan. Now this is where the story starts to get a bit contentious, and some Mopar purists start to get angry. John Aruza of Aruza High Performance, known for building high-performance Hemi engines, had been asking Landy to sell him the ball Hemi for years, and eventually convinced him to do so. Now where some get upset is, instead of taking this extremely rare, one-of-a-kind, maybe one of two motors and keeping it as is, John decided to rebuild it and modified it extensively. A new crank was ordered, and it was punched 30 over, resulting in 481 cubic inches now. Custom Boss 429 pistons were used, and it was built to 9.6 to 1 compression. The intake was ground and reworked so that ThermoQuad was now history, and a Holley 800 CFM carb topped it off. The intake ports, and exhaust manifolds all were worked over. Cam, electric distributor, MST ignition, oil pan, valve covers, air cleaner, etc. all changed. And to top it off, Tom Hoover, the father of the Hemi, sold Aruza a rare 69 440 Barracuda in 2004. Aruza took the 440 out of it and dropped the ball Hemi in that car. The car was eventually sold and now sits on display at the National Auto and Truck Museum in Indiana. Now, if I didn't touch on this hate surrounding this, I'm sure I'd have to answer to it in the comments below. I understand why people are upset about what Aruza did. Like, I get it, this thing is rare, and it'd be cool to keep it as original as possible and just put it on display somewhere. But again, the vast majority of the work done on it was internals. So really, other than the intake and machining, most of it can be undone. People also forget that Dick Landy did a fair bit of work on it himself in order to produce more horsepower than the 426. Providing all the parts like the valve covers and air cleaner were just thrown in the garbage. I'm okay with it. I've seen people suggest that it gets scanned and recast, and I think about it, I'm like, what has Aruza really done that prevents that from happening? The porting work and stuff doesn't really change the motor or the head design itself. The intake is gone as it was hacked for a Holley, but it was going to be scanned. If it's going to be scanned, it can be recast. So I'm sure it could still be done for a ThermoQuad if so desired, but not many people use them. Those are just my thoughts. I'll get back to the history on it here. In August 2008, a user on the message board, thehemi.com, who goes by the name Mart, spotted an eBay listing for an A279 ball Hemi motor. This motor was 90% completed. According to the listing, all that it needed to be completed was some valve covers and some intake work. It was pegged at 472 cubic inches, and the work was mostly completed by, you guessed it, no other than John Aruza. There was something like 11 photos of the listing, and it appeared to be genuine. I was able to track down the seller and speak to him. He advised me that essentially what happened was John Aruza had another set of cylinder heads for the ball Hemi, and they took a modified RB block, and they were able to get the heads to work on it. So all that was left to get done to get the motor running was some intake work and the valve covers made. He eventually sold it to a person for a running 426 and some cash, and this motor now resides with that said person in Southern California somewhere.
Well, there you have it, guys. Chrysler's A279 ball stud Hemi. Literally a victim of the times. It was a day late, dollar short. Chrysler's financial problems and everything else that basically killed the muscle car era, killed that motor. It's unfortunate because I think it would have been a really good motor. But, well, instead of that, I've got a 440 now. So I can't complain too much. If you guys enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Hit the bell to get notified when new videos come out. And I'll see you on the next one. Take it easy.